So I was talking last time about institutional approaches to the study of power, and I'm going to keep talking about them. And remember, I said from the beginning that it was very important to note with every theory what's the basic question it's asking. I made that point for theories of stratification, and I'll make the same point for theories of power. And I contrasted power elite, pluralist, and Marxist class theories of power. And now we're talking about institutional approaches. And I said that institutional approaches involve asking the question, how much power is there in the system? And what institutions allow systems to get more done versus get less done? Now, this is an especially important, in my view, neglected and difficult approach. And one of the reasons it's difficult goes back to our early discussions of institutions, which is that institutions, and remember by institution we meant both concrete organizations and the larger sort of definition of what something like a family or a university is and the purposes associated with that. Well, you can think of governments also as being institutions in this sense. There is a general definition of what government should be doing. So I was reading this morning about a horrible renewal of civil war in the Congo. I don't know if you've been paying attention to the news at all, but as has happened several times in the past with horrendous millions of people killed. These are just human tragedies on a scale you can hardly comprehend. Rape, displacement, starvation, disease, murder on an enormous scale. And so an army has emerged again, it's been there for a while, but anyway, in eastern Congo, and has started conquering territory in the eastern part of the country where there are a lot of valuable mining opportunities and so forth. And we have an idea of what a nation state should be as an institution, right? So the government of the thing called, ironically, the Democratic Republic of Congo, that's the name of the country, ought to be able to govern it. That means provide roads, schools, access to health care, basic security, police forces, rule of law, and so forth. And clearly, the whole international community feels wildly uncomfortable about a situation in which the thing that is supposedly the government of the nation doesn't govern. So the actual army of the Democratic Republic of Congo collapsed as soon as these rebel forces started marching toward these now they're conquering major cities. They're not just out in the bush somewhere murdering a few villagers. They are in two of the major huge cities on the eastern part of the country. So it's a terrible situation. But I just want to point out that governments are fundamentally very important kinds of institutions, but they are extra peculiar because so here, how can I put it? We treat the institutions of government, of any particular state, as if they were permanent structures. We do this with all institutions, marriage, the family, so on and so forth, and yet they also can be constantly changed. And the question is, if you change them really quickly, then there are no firm rules within which political competition, the competition among different interests, the competition for power and influence can take place. If you don't change them at all, then they don't, well, eventually I think they collapse because they don't respond to the interests of various groups. But I just want to take the recent elections as an example and point out how fundamental the taken for granted institutional rules were So I want to start first with voting. So however bitter the political conflict in the last 2 elections has been, and actually the bitterness goes back sometime before that, where you say, you know, if he wins, I'm getting on a plane and moving to Sweden. Or if he wins, apparently there's seriously some kind of movement in Texas to secede from the United States because Barack Obama won, right? So people say things like that, but in fact, it's just amazing the degree to which, for all the dirtiness that sometimes there in politics, the huge amounts of money spent, the attempts at vote suppression, that nonetheless, when one person actually gets many, many more votes than the other person, everybody agrees that that person has won and that person gets to be president. That is an example of political institutions that rely on elections to determine who the leader of a country is. That is not a universal in human history by any means, and it isn't even a universal in contemporary society, since fake elections, no elections, I mean, those of you who follow what's going on in contemporary China, they just had a big change of government, and nobody elected anybody except within the Politburo, within the sort of central committee of the Chinese Communist Party. Although they also have a very complex set of institutions, and you play a game within those institutions to try to get the right allies, to try to influence the right people who do have a vote. And if you win, you've won, and pretty much if you lose, there's not a military coup or something like that. The losing side or sides back off and go home and lick their wounds and wait for another day. So there are political institutions in that sense, and then I'm going to talk a little more today about something that was very important in last week's reading about winner-take-all politics, which is the way American political institutions right now have led to or permitted, it's not clear, a situation of increasingly dysfunctional polarization in Congress. So I said before that American institutions altogether are in some ways designed and in some ways through happenstance have come about to create lots of opportunities for paralysis. So the fact that there are many different jurisdictions in the United States with state, local, federal, but also with many, many, many regulatory bodies like zoning boards. And in the city of Berkeley, you basically cannot build anything without getting your building project through the landmarks and historic preservation committees of the city council, and those committees were extremely hostile to basically changing anything. So it's very difficult to build something new if you can't tear down the old thing. I'll make a brief comment, which is the synagogue I attend, in which I'm very active, needed a new building, and they bought the building that had been JV Liquors on University Avenue, which is right next to where the old train station was. There was a train station, and then there was a restaurant called the Depot, which was in the train station. And there was some question about whether the historic preservation people on the Landmarks Commission would allow our synagogue to build a new building on the site of a liquor store. So the joke was that we were going to rename our synagogue B'nai Vodka, which that would mean House of Vodka. But we did not do that. But what we did do is keep the identical footprint of the original building. So our building is no larger than the liquor store was. It's literally on the same footprint, and it has the same roof line. So the architects built this gorgeous, gorgeous building that basically imitated the architectural structure of JV Liquors. Now, they weren't forced to do that. I want to say they weren't sure what the Landmarks Commission might do, and they just didn't want to go there. They didn't want the thing hung up for years. The school next door that bought the train station cannot change it, and they can't build anything that prevents you from driving by it and seeing it at some angle they've calculated that people in cars can still see the building. So if you drive by that, if you happen to drive down University Avenue, you will see what is an extremely funny looking outcome. There is our quite, if I might say, elegant, beautiful building. Next door is a big kind of modern blue school. It was Berkeley Montessori School. And then there is this train station, which is very cute. It's kind of a mission architecture, Adobe and so forth, but it no longer fits its architectural surroundings at all. And so it's preserved there. The school cannot build an auditorium. There's not enough room, and the original building doesn't have enough room for an auditorium, so they use our synagogue's auditorium for their auditorium, and the two, you know, there's a little gate between the two institutions, and they cooperate. It's all wonderful, wonderful. We use their parking on Saturdays. But you can just see that getting something done in the city of Berkeley is an extraordinarily, even if you're private economy, you raise the money, you want to build a building, you want to build more, you have got to navigate an extraordinarily complex political landscape. So American political institutions are in some ways built to make it easier to block things and harder to ram things through than in many, many other political institutions. Added to that, and I won't go into extraordinary detail here, but Hacker and Pearson, whom you read last week, one of the things they have pointed to is the institutional sources of growing polarization in the American political parties. So it doesn't appear that Americans as individuals were becoming more polarized, and that's why the parties became more polarized, that the American public was becoming more polarized. It actually looks as though the political institutions led to polarization at the level of political parties. This has to do, you know all these things from the newspaper, and so I won't go into them in detail, but things like the ability of politicians to gerrymander, that means manipulate voting districts to create safe seats for incumbent legislators. What that means is that for members of the House in particular, and remember, it's the House that's the more radicalized, the more polarized institution, once they get the political district set so that Republicans have a safe seat, there is no way a Democrat can be elected in that district, or vice versa, Democrats have a safe seat, then the only election that matters is the primary. Because if you win the primary, you will win the general election. And that means that the party activists, who tend to be extremists, who are more likely to vote, more likely to be active, more likely to know what's going on, have the chance, as the Tea Party people have done in the last couple of election cycles, to run really, really extreme candidates and get them nominated. Now, for Senate races, that blew up in their face this time. They nominated a bunch of quite conservative, very, very conservative people, and mostly those people lost. Because Senate, there's no Senate district. Senators are elected by a whole state. But in the House, where these districts are relatively small and the district boundaries can be reset after every census, and as long as the legislature and the governor of a state agree on a certain way of setting the districts, they can be challenged in court. So these are the sort of arcane aspects of political institutions, which are not set in stone. You can change the way you do this. So California, in the last election, or 2 elections ago, I can't remember, voted through their initiative system, which is, again, another one of our political institutions, right? California has this weird, you get a petition together and you get enough signatures and you can put anything on the ballot. And one of the things that went on the ballot is to have a nonpartisan commission set the political districts. Well, that is a radical change. If you did that, I always felt we should agree to do that only if Texas agreed to do it at the same time. But because it basically was that California, where it was liberal Democrats, were going to get these nonpartisan commissions setting up their districts, and Texas, which is highly Republican, was going to continue to be able to manipulate and gerrymander all over the place. But in fact, weirdly enough, it ended up that these districts ended up favoring the Democrats, actually, when they did more sort of equal, more nonpartisan districts. So all of this sounds arcane, sounds boring, but these institutional legacies are what shape the capacity of political systems to get things done, or in the case of our own current political system, to be able not to get things done. And so I'll go down one level of graininess more. As you probably know or should know, the current rules about filibustering in the Senate mean that unless one party has 60 votes, it basically cannot get legislation through, even if it's in the majority, because the minority party can block the progress of the legislation. They can't determine the vote on it, but they can determine that it will never come up by claiming they're going to filibuster. This is an old institutional rule that was part of the Senate's history. The rule itself can be changed. So there is actually, I read about this in Sunday's New York Times, there is yet again a proposal to radically transform the Senate by basically creating a procedure in which if you get 51 votes, you can get your legislation forwarded. The Democrats would benefit from this right now since they have a majority in the Senate, but this is the way institutions work. They are very aware that if they change the underlying rules of the game, that's what institutions are. They're something like codified rules of the game that no one dares change right now. Sometimes that no one's thought about changing. That's true for some institutions, but often that no one, it's not that they haven't thought about it, it's that they don't dare, because they may know that down the road somewhere, they'll be in the minority, and they'll be desperate to be able to use their 47 votes or their 45 votes or their 41 votes to block legislation they really hate. So this is the way political institutions have powerful effects on outcomes. They determine, in some sense, what capacities a political system has. Okay, now, I talked about Parsons' work on the concept of political power and his insight that political systems vary not just in how they divide up the goodies among different groups, which is the usual way we think about power, A's power over B, as a zero-sum game in which if one person wins, the other person necessarily loses by definition. And Parsons instead focused attention on how much capacity a political system had, how much capacity it had to govern, how much capacity it had to get things done. So the irony, if I go back to the Congo, is that even if this rebel army wins in the Congo, it also will not be able to govern effectively because there really aren't a set of political institutions there that work. So being able to overthrow the current head of state and chase him away or kill him, that'd be more likely, and dissolve whatever legislature there is. Okay, you think, wow, we won, we created, maybe even let's imagine, I hope they don't do this, but let's imagine that they murdered the entire set of cronies of the current government, so the ruling group, whoever they are. They just get rid of them all. They're none. And let's even imagine all their family members, so they're really not there anymore. What would they have once they won? And the answer is pretty much chaos. Because where there isn't a set of functioning political institutions, overthrowing them doesn't really get you much. Now, what it might get, and that may be what they're hoping for, is some kind of international aid funds. And that is one of the sources that anything that claims to be a government gets to, there's, you know, the sluice gates open, aid flows in, it's a desperate situation, and they can cream off 5%, 10%, 20%, 80%, depends on what the international community will tolerate. Okay, so that's the basic point about political institutions. Now, I next want to talk about the work of Samuel Huntington briefly, and here I have to jump around in slides. Okay, if you want to understand how political institutions work, you basically have to understand things comparatively and historically. That is, you have to ask, how would things be different if you had a different set of political institutions? So my first point was about American political institutions and the current, what Hacker and Pearson call asymmetric polarization. And what they mean by that, actually, is that the Republicans have actually become much more extreme than the Democrats. And there are all sorts of measures of this in terms of the kind of legislation they sponsor, in terms of the distance between legislators and public opinion, and so forth. But you can think of this as having to do with the whole set of capacities that American political parties, local leaders in political systems, strong political machines like the Daley machine in Chicago, which overcomes some of this fragmentation, how much do they get done? And I pointed out in the last lecture that political parties and strong political actors in the US who manage to get lots of control. So even if the formal institutions are all separate, you need the zoning board and the, again, I use the example of the Giants ballpark, and you need Caltrain, and you need this, and you need that. If you have really strong political figures who have, over time, collected a lot of favors, and a lot of people owe them, and often those people are party politicians who use the political party to accumulate power, they then have the ability to call in those chits and get things done. So getting the ballpark in San Francisco depended on the extraordinary political skills of Willie Brown, who had been mayor of San Francisco, and he had been Speaker of the California Assembly, and he was one of the most skilled, he's still, I shouldn't say was, he's still around, but he's basically an attorney now. But he was one of the most skilled California politicians ever. One year I signed a biography of him in Social 1 in this class. He's really an amazing, amazing guy. And he had political clout and could force things through. So political institutions are partly places where power accumulates and can be used, and in principle can be used to generate more power. So the political institutions in Congo don't work, and so they can't be used to accumulate more power than you have in the barrel of your guns right now. And you can get done things that your soldiers can do, but these armies in the Congo can't even keep, they're not institutionalized enough to keep their own soldiers from looting, raping, murdering at random, pillaging. And part of the scandal in the Congo right now is that one of the generals who was supposed to be defending this eastern part of the country was just dismissed because he had been selling arms from the government's store of armaments to, actually not apparently to the rebels, but to a group of poachers who were probably killing important wildlife that you guys would care about. But so when you hear that story, then you realize, oh my goodness, we have remarkably effective political institutions. Nobody in our army would be selling off major supplies of weapons for private gain, not because they wouldn't want to or be tempted to, although that cultural assumption kind of gets built in. If you live within a set of institutions, you take for granted a certain level of honesty. Nobody has approached me since I have been at Berkeley and tried to buy a grade. It just never happened. Nobody's even thought about it. Whereas I bet in countries that some of you come from, that would not be unthinkable at all and might even happen. But you are used to a certain set of institutions that enforce obligations on people. So you might not like what happens. You might not like decisions the government makes. You might not like what the Army does or what the CIA does or something. But it's amazing the degree to which these are effective political institutions. Okay, then I want to go to this guy, Samuel Huntington. Now, he has a very bad reputation. If you've ever heard of him, you've heard about a book he wrote in his dotage, in his very old age, that basically said, oh, the modern world there's a clash of civilizations, and basically Islam threatens all the values we wonderful Westerners care about. So he really got a horrible reputation from that. But he was one of the most important political scientists of the second half of the 20th century. And I think the real value of his work still has not been completely exploited. He was the inspiration for a bunch of people who write now, Francis Fukuyama and a bunch of these, well-known, I don't know what you call them, theorists, commentators, and so forth. But I want to point to what was incredibly important about his work, which is he looked at economic development in the third world. And he made the point that you couldn't get effective economic development without what he called political development first or at the same time. And so all the economists in the West, starting in the 1960s, believed that post-World War II, at the end of colonialism, all these newly independent states were going to develop just the way the West had. And everything was going to be great. And there was something called an Alliance for Progress in Latin America, and there were foreign aid projects all over Africa and all over many parts of Asia. And then, guess what? It just didn't happen in most of these places. And it did happen in a few places. Taiwan, Hong Kong, the Asian tigers. Why? The basic reason, and Huntington saw this early on, is that those places had effective, sometimes by our lights, excessively centralized. That is, if you take Korea, there was a period of just one dictatorship after another. But these were places that were effectively governed. So investors could invest there without their money being stolen. They could count on some reasonable rule of law to protect their economic activities. The government could develop economic policies that promoted development for the country as a whole. So you saw this very strongly in both Korea and Taiwan, that the government for one period imposed what was called import substitution development, which is they put huge tariffs or sometimes completely blocked imports of certain things, like in Korea, the cars. So basically, if you lived in Korea in the 1970s, you couldn't buy a foreign-made car. And that nurtured the development of Korean manufacturing. This happened also in Taiwan. So very effective, strong government. Not only could pass these things, but could enforce them, right? Political institutions have to actually be able to build and wield power. You can't have effective political institutions if they don't have power. And these institutions had the power to impose these tariffs on foreign products that nurtured domestic industry. And then the amazing thing is, when those industries got healthy enough, strong enough, big enough to compete internationally, the political institutions were effective enough to resist being captured by local manufacturing interests who said, we don't want, what do you mean competition? We've had this wonderful situation where, you know, we're the only car companies that can operate in Korea and no one can import Toyotas or Fords or anything else. And at some point, they forced their own manufacturers to compete internationally. And that is what allowed the development of these Asian tigers. So what Huntington saw is that you cannot have economic development without the development of effective political institutions. And in fact, Huntington argued, I don't know whether correctly or not, that one reason during the 1960s that in many ways communist regimes were very attractive to third world countries. And liberal democracy, which we think is just by far the superior system, much, much, much better, were regarded with real suspicion. And it wasn't just because dictators wanted to keep being dictators and rake in the money. It was because we were offering no good theory of political development. We didn't have advice to give people about how you believe in how you develop strong institutions, how you develop effective political systems. Why? Because we basically believed that markets regulate themselves. And that if you just export free markets and the ideology of free markets, development will happen. And Huntington saw that actually development can't happen. That it takes strong, effective political institutions to keep free markets free. Free markets require extraordinary levels of regulation, of monitoring, of preventing monopoly, of preventing corruption, of creating transparency. This is what, if you go right back to the first reading in the course, to Acemoglu and Robinson, that is exactly what they're talking about. That where you don't have inclusive institutions, political institutions, you can't have effective free markets, right? So Huntington really was making the point that effective economic development really depended on political development, and at least the communists, whom he, by the way, hated. I mean, he was an anti-communist, a major, but he was saying, we're not competing effectively. We're not really offering a model of how you develop politically. They offer a model of a centralized communist party that can sort of govern all the way down, and right in the middle of both the conflict with Cuba and the Vietnam War, he was pointing to the superior political development of Cuba. So the US kept trying to infiltrate Cuba to overthrow Castro, and we would send little groups of people who would land on the beach who were Cuban exiles. I mean, they spoke, you know, Cuban Spanish with no foreign accent. They were Cuban. And they would get spotted, reported, and turned in within days. Why? Because Cuba has an amazingly effective, it may be bad morally, it may be bad in many, many ways. It certainly in some ways has held their economy back, but they have very, very effective political institutions on the ground, so that every group of families is organized into 10 households, and those are organized into 10, you know, groups of households, and those are organized. And so everybody on the island basically is under some kind of supervision at all times. So the idea that somebody randomly lands on your beach and you're going to hide them in your hut and give them a base from which to make trouble for the regime, no, you're not. No, you're not. And so he made the point, and this was true many times over in Vietnam. He said that the North Vietnamese were organized all the way down. They used their Communist Party organization. It was a brutal regime, yes, but you know, it was an amazingly effective regime. And it won. I'll just point that out. It won. And the South Vietnamese, he said the generals were afraid to leave Saigon and go out into the countryside because they thought that behind them some other general was going to stage a coup and take their command away. In other words, weak political institutions versus strong, effective political institutions. And so not good, bad, not nice, non-nice, but effective wielders of power. And I would argue that if you look at the world today, you will find that many of these post-communist regimes, which had effective centralized political power, are actually doing surprisingly well economically. So North Vietnam being one of the star examples. All right. Then I'm going to use one more really important example here, but I'm going to tie it to this diagram. So if you compare all the theories of power we've looked at, they are theories that largely focus on the inputs to the political process. That is, who has more resources to influence power, right? And that's power elite theorists. Who participates in decisions? That's the pluralist theory. And pluralist theory focuses on a bunch of really important things, like who can get organized to pursue their interests, what groups can mobilize, what's their capacity for organizing, the whole study of social movements. How did we get a civil rights movement with effective leadership that could sort of break down the barriers that were keeping African Americans out of the American political system? So looks at the input side, everything that helps people have power. And you know, some people have a lot more resources than others, and that's part of that input side. I said Marxist theories actually do look at outcomes. So who wins? But what institutional theory focuses your attention on is this black box in the middle. And it says the kind of institutions you have determine how the inputs will be transformed into outcomes. And so here's where I would make a very general claim that I think there's good data to support this from the OECD countries, that is from the developed industrial countries, that the stronger and more effective your political institutions, however unequal the inputs, that is, some people are a lot richer than others, some people have a lot more, you know, control whole industries or have giant corporations, or and other people are in small, despised minority groups or whatever, that does not automatically determine what the outcomes will be. And that, in fact, where you have stronger, more effective political institutions, the relative amount of, let's call it justice, that comes out the other end of the political system is greater. So weak political institutions leave the social inequalities that were the inputs to the political system pretty much intact, or sometimes even exaggerate them. So these people had all the power to start with. You've got very weak political institutions. They directly appoint their brothers, their cronies, their friends to run whatever political institutions there are. And so the political institutions have one and only one purpose, which is to preserve the power of the powerful, right? If you have stronger political institutions that actually have greater capacity to accumulate power, typically, you also get greater capacity to modulate the effects of the unequal inputs to the political system and transform them into relatively, not completely, relatively more egalitarian outcomes. Now, these are, the systems I'm talking about are all democratic systems. So one way to think about that is that those political institutions depend on voting. Voting is basically the egalitarian trump card, despite all the other inequalities. Okay, now I want to go to this theta-Skocpol argument, I guess, here, and see if I can get it in before the break, because it is a really fascinating, really important example of institutional thinking. And so this person's name is a funny, hard name to pronounce or to spell, Theda Skocpol. She's a sociologist with joint appointments at Harvard in political science and sociology, one of the most influential thinkers of her generation in political sociology. And what she pointed to was precisely this issue of the crucial role of institutions in both, well, in outcomes. And I'm going to give you an example from one of her papers. It's a paper that actually the title is in the earlier slide, written with a guy named Kenneth Feingold. And it's about the New Deal. And the argument they make is that during the Great Depression of the 1930s, you all know about the Great Depression, right? Yes. Both the industrial interests in the US and the agricultural interests were desperate to use government to help recoup their fortunes. And the way to do that during the midst of the Great Depression, they both saw very clearly, was to somehow restrict production. So, because what the situation they had was that in a situation of collapse, prices had fallen so low that it was generally not in the interests of manufacturers to manufacture and not in the interests of farmers to farm, because they couldn't be sure they could sell what they produced for more than it cost them. And competition kept those prices incredibly low because there were huge surpluses of manufactured goods, huge surpluses of agricultural produce, and consumers didn't have enough money to buy this stuff. So, in both the agricultural arena and the industrial arena, farmers and industrialists pushed to have government help them restrict production, to drive up prices, to make it worthwhile manufacturing or worthwhile farming so that they could generate some income that would eventually support consumption, so create demand. And they tried to do this through two pieces of legislation: the National Industrial Recovery Act, NIRA, and the Agricultural Adjustment Administration. So the interests were the same. If you want to go back to that diagram about inputs, the inputs were the same, which is you had interested parties who dominated their arena wanting to restrict production. They knew what their interests were and they were pursuing it. They got themselves together, they got legislation passed. And the NIRA, the industrial thing, was a total failure. The industrialists agreed to restrict production. They agreed to set prices high enough to make manufacturing worthwhile. And then there was no way to really enforce it. They all got together. The government freed them of these antitrust laws that would have gotten in their way. And they went ahead and started cheating on this side and competing and lowering their prices, and the whole thing collapsed. The Agricultural Adjustment Administration was a tremendous success, and it actually set up the system of protections that we have to this day. Why? Because the agricultural arena in the United States had a long history of developing political institutions that incorporated and served agriculture. These were the people who distributed new seeds and new fertilizers and new agricultural ideas. So they were the Farm Bureau federations, which had worked with the Department of Agriculture for generations. They were the land-grant colleges, like UC Davis and Berkeley, that had done research for farmers and that knew what was planted on every acre of crops in the every acre of land, farmland in the United States. And so you could do agricultural planning in America. And they did do it. And they offered people subsidies for producing less, and people produced less. There was no equivalent in the industrial arena. You can't do industrial planning in the US. There are no institutions that allow industrial planning. Industrialists have fought for generations to make sure no one could plan. No one knows what's produced by every industry. You could no more develop a general industrial plan for the US than you could fly to the moon. So institutions made the difference in whether these interested parties were able to get the outcomes they wanted.